So you might be wondering what is going on with New World. It's been several months since I talked about the game. My last video coming out on April 15th, where I talked about the game's delay from a May to August launch, as well as the beta getting pushed back, and how a bunch of the fan base was simply not excited. Now, the reason I haven't made any new videos isn't because nothing has happened. You know, I was making a video every time they released a new blog post or video update, and it was starting to get a bit repetitive, so I wanted to wait some time until we got a decent chunk of information. And that time is now. We have several new official videos, including 2 developer diaries and some kind of cinematic action trailers. And then we also have some unofficial videos with various game sites doing interviews, giving us a bunch of more details. So I kind of want to go over everything that's new, where the game sits at the moment, and I guess what's going on with New World and whether or not you should be worried about the game. Just to preface this, I think it's looking decent, but you know, let's get into it. First thing I want to touch on was the dev diary War and Invasions. Here they dove into the war and invasion systems. So they talked about how the world is divided into these several different territories, and these can be controlled by a company of players. Companies, essentially their version of guilds. Now, once a company controls a territory, other companies get to declare war, and if they do, a 50-versus 50 battle for control of that territory will ensue. Now, the controlling company gets to set what's known as the siege window. It's basically a time frame where the battle can take place. And then once the battle commences, the attacking side has to use siege weapons and try to take down the gates and capture the base. Meanwhile, the defenders will be using their own defensive siege weapons, things like this mighty horn to buff their allies, cannons and ballistas to try to stop the invaders. And the war has a set period of time. I believe they mentioned it was an hour in particular. So the defending players have to stop the invaders. The attacking players have to break down the gates and then capture the flag in the center of the fort to get control. And whatever happens at the end of the hour determines who owns that fort going forward. Now, a funny quote from this video.
It's a new level of social dynamism that no other game has.
I totally understand they're trying to set their game apart, but it's just a castle siege and a zone control. That's really, I mean, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Besides the war, the video also touched a bit on the invasion system. These are these wave-based PvE survival modes where these corrupted breaches that grow in strength over time throughout the territory can eventually get so strong that they will begin attacking your forts, at which point you'll have to fend off hundreds of corrupted enemies attacking your base. There'll be all sorts, the basic enemy types as well as boss creatures. And then if you defend successfully, you get to keep your fort, of course, but then you can also get things like rewards of loot, money, and reputation. So that was the War and Invasion developer diary. Shortly after that, they released this video that they called Combat Unleashed. This is basically just the cinematic, lots of fancy camera angles, fast cuts, and some shaking and action music. It started off showing some PvE elements and then moved on to showing some cuts of PvP. And also at the end, we got to see a few shots of different types of boss creatures, which was pretty cool. And this giant floating head, which I believe this belongs to the Ancients faction, like this mystical creatures that came to the island before anybody else and constructed the, you know, whatever. So yeah, this video was kind of just a hype video, but it was cool to see nevertheless. And then finally, the last big official video that we got on New World was another developer diary. And this one covered a bit of crafting and the progression system. So they talked about how the game has 5 different types of progression. There's of course leveling, character progression, in which you get higher and get unlock points to put into attributes for your character. There's the weapon mastery system, where kind of like in games like Skyrim, the more you use a weapon, the better you get, and then as you level it up, you can assign points for different types of weapon abilities. There are the trade skills, and that's going to be like the gathering and doing things like blacksmithing, similar to weapon mastery. The more you do these things, the better that you get. There's also your territory standing, where playing and doing quests within a territory will grant you reputation, which will then give you bonuses, things like increased experience and reduced fees within that territory. And then the final type of progression system is the faction system. Once you reach level 10 in the game, you get to pick from one of the 3 factions, and then you will do faction-specific missions to gain reputation, which will unlock items and gear from your faction vendor. And now, besides touching on the 5 different progression systems, they go a bit further. They really are trying to make this deep crafting system. Again, as you craft, you get better. So you're going to start off being just able to make a base sword, and then you will get progressively unlock better and better ones. Pretty standard RPG mechanics there. They also mentioned that you can add perks to your weapons, like fire damage or reducing its weight. There will be gem slots in the game as well. And in order to make some of that higher tier weapons and gear, it's going to require materials from high level gatherers who are able to collect these unique resources to make those high value items. They say also that trade skills in this game are going to offer endless progression.
Our trade skill system features endless progression. As you create things, you get experience points that give you levels, and you can level forever.
Maybe when I was 20, that would have been exciting news for me, but frankly nowadays, I don't like endless progression systems. It's just an infinite grind. There's literally no end to it. So not the most exciting news hearing that, but you know, whatever. Not every aspect of the game has to be tailor-made for me, of course. And then they wrap up with a couple of minutes of the developers talking about just how excited they are to be releasing this game.
Working on New World has been a crazy experience. I want players to fall in love with the art and the places that we've established.
It's kind of sweet, you know, it's nice to see the human element of this thing. Like, you know, there are real people working on this. Well, however you might feel about Amazon games and the titles that they've released so far, or just Amazon in general, corporations, however you feel, there are real people involved in the game making process. And frankly, for me, it's nice to see that some of the things that they're excited for. That doesn't mean it's going to be a good game, but it's nice to see that it's nice to get a glimpse of maybe people caring, even if it's just a PR stunt, whatever. Now, besides those official videos on the New World YouTube channel, there's been a lot of non-official stuff that also gave us quite a bit of new information. Some of this coming from IGN's Summer of Gaming event. They did an interview in which we got a bunch of questions answered and some more further details about the title. So to just start off with asking, what is New World? And I actually kind of appreciated this nice rough synopsis of the game. He said it's an open world MMO set in the age of exploration that blends directed content with quest and deep story, with lots of emergent gameplay, action-based combat, and a deep progression system. They touched on how the combat system really makes skill matter. It's all about positioning and timing. It's also physical-based combat, meaning that your swings and attacks have to actually connect with the enemy. And then they talked about how they wanted to keep a lot of the traditional MMO aspects like progression systems, world building, and storytelling, while also adding some open world elements and opportunities for players to create their own stories through things like territory control and the wars. And then near the end of the video, they touched a little bit on the PvE aspect of the game, mentioning that they're going to have a lot of quests and missions that kind of get you out and exploring the world. But on top of that, there will be tons of points of interest, things like these world events and bosses to fight and areas to explore that are going to draw players into the homes of the various NPC factions in the game. So that is the interview that happened with IGN. IGN also separately released this War Mode PvP video. It was 16 minutes of this dual commentary. Didn't think the video was great. I don't know if it was just the editing or the PvP in general, but wasn't really exciting to watch, wasn't really entertaining. I found myself tuning out pretty quick. As much as that would lead me to despair, the next video, released by Mine MMO, was 11 minutes of gameplay with decent chunks in between cuts that really, I think, gave a good feel for how the general gameplay experience is. It started off with them exploring some ruins and taking out these creatures inside of this kind of ancient temple looking thing. And then there's a big segment of them attacking this camp of corrupted enemies. You then see them walking around a player-owned fort, doing a little bit of crafting. We also got a quick look at the inventory and the emote system. And then near the end, we see some fighting of forest creatures around this like magical mystical tree. We also see them invading this graveyard filled with these undead creatures. Was actually really impressed with some of the different animations that we saw from some of the creature deaths here. And then finally, there was this little like mini boss fight. I say mini boss because they took it down in a matter of like 15 seconds, but it was clearly harder than a standard enemy. So that is most of it. That's all of the official stuff that we got from the New World YouTube channel. Some of the recent non-official videos that I think really gave us some pretty cool new information. And overall, I think New World is looking decent. I'm not gonna lie that my hype for this game has been diminishing over time, although as I sat down and tried to wrap up the past few months of content getting ready to make this video, I find myself getting excited again. I think especially if you check out anything that I covered here in this video, go watch that Mine MMO 11 minutes of gameplay. I think that was the thing out of everything that we've seen in the past few months. That was the thing that had me most excited. It was cool to see a variety of areas. It was cool to see some decent chunks of unedited gameplay. I think it looks like a decent open world action combat game. You know, who knows how the long-term progression is going to be? Who knows how interesting that PvP system is going to be? I know this game is going to continue to have these detractors, I guess, people who are just continuing to crap on it, and that's mainly due to the fact that last year they made that big shift in direction. This game originally was like this open world, full-on PvP all the time, where you could drop some of your loot when you died, and it's shifted now into like structured PvP and more focus on some traditional MMO elements, and then pushing a bunch of PvE stuff into the game before launch. But even with that shift in direction, and even though this game is going to have its naysayers, I'm still gonna stay cautiously optimistic. Even though my hype isn't quite what it was at the beginning of the year or towards the end of 2019, I'm still looking forward to this. It's also one of the few MMOs on the horizon, and I have to check it out. A couple of other things have happened over these past few months that I should mention. Namely, we saw the launch of Crucible. It had terrible review scores, getting about a 50 on both Open and Metacritic, with mixed reviews on Steam. Checking out the Steam charts, it had a 10,000 player all-time peak, but over the past couple of weeks, they've been hovering between 50 and 200 players. Basically, people think the game is bad, and it's more or less dead at this point. So much so that they just decided they are unreleasing the game. So the game launched last month. It's going back into beta. I've never seen this happen. I mean, maybe with the exception of something like Final Fantasy XIV and then releasing them and then taking it back and then re-releasing it. It's not too often you see a game launch and then unlaunch. But I mentioned Crucible because this is Amazon Game Studios' most recent title. Prior to that, they released the Grand Tour game, which had around a 50 on Open and Metacritic. And then the other game that Amazon Game Studios was working on called Breakaway, this team-based multiplayer brawler, never got released. They full on canceled it. So the point is, Amazon Game Studios is off to a pretty terrible start. Now, with that said, it's probably the case that the people who worked on Crucible and the Grand Tour game and who were working on Breakaway aren't the exact same people who are working on New World. It's not a good look. That doesn't have any direct impact on whether or not New World is going to turn out to be a good game, but it doesn't set a good precedent. We have reason to be concerned because as a company, Amazon has not done a good job when it comes to releasing quality video games up until this point. However, we remain hopeful, and hopefully New World ends up being a good game. To sum it up, you know, I'm still looking forward to it. As a huge MMO fan, I have to check this thing out. And the more gameplay I see, it does look better, still a little bit rough around the edges, but I think there is the potential for something good here. I say that a lot, but I only really talk about games that I am potentially excited for, so that's probably the main reason. So yeah, there you go. That's New World. I think we should be cautious, optimistic, but cautious. And good luck, Amazon. You're gonna need it because you haven't done great thus far.